Hello and welcome back to episode 3 of Ecclesiastes, episode 3, chapter 3. I hope you got a chance to read ahead, and if you didn't though, not to worry. I'm going to talk us through this chapter. It's one of my favourite chapters of the book actually. I've been really looking forward to it, so let's jump right in. Chapter 3 begins with this beautiful and wonderful poem. It's a poem about time. It's one of the more famous parts of the book of Ecclesiastes. There's a time for everything, chapter 3, verse 1, and a season for every activity under the heavens. A time to be born and a time to die. A time to plant and a time to uproot. A time to kill and a time to heal. A time to tear down. A time to build, and on it goes, kind of chronicling all of the events that fill our lives. You could even say these are the days of our lives. But when we look at this poem and we start to try and understand what it means and what it's saying, the temptation might be for us to say, well, these are the choices that I have to make in life. And the real challenge for me is to decide when I must plant and when I must uproot, when I must weep and when I must laugh. But really, rather than being a poem which determines when we do things, as we get further into chapter 3, we're going to discover that this is actually a poem that emphasizes God's sovereignty over time. We have no control over time, do we? There are 24 hours in a day. You can't make it go faster or slower. Time management, I've discovered, is really a bit of a myth. You can't manage time. Time just is. You can manage your energy and where you put your priorities. Energy management is probably a better way to talk about it. But you can't manage time. It's out of our control. And yet time is not outside of God's control. God ordains time and the time for things. He's the Lord over all history, and the Lord not just over time here, but, as we're about to discover, time that is to come. So as we read through this poem, we're reminded that we are helpless in the flow of time, and yet God is sovereign over it. Have a look at verse 10. I have seen the burden God has laid on the human race. He has made everything beautiful in its time. He's also set eternity in the human heart, yet no one can fathom what God has done from beginning to end. So here's one of the great things about being human. You have a yearning, a sense that there is more than today. You anticipate tomorrow. You look into the future. And all of us, whether you're Christian or not, have a sense that there must be something beyond this world. Even the most ancient Bronze Age civilizations would bury their dead with beads and shells and furs and trinkets, in the hope, in the expectation, in the yearning that there's something beyond the world that we know, life under the sun, as Ecclesiastes puts it. That's a wonderful thing. It's a hint of something more, and yet the teacher says it's a terrible burden. God has set eternity in our hearts, and yet we cannot fathom what God has done from beginning to end. Again, we're trapped in this closed system. We don't have the mind of God. We can't see beyond the horizon, but we know that there's something there. One of the more crazy things I do to keep myself sane is to go open water swimming. So they put markers out off the beach, and off you go. You swim out into the surf and to beyond for a couple of kilometres, come back, and are thankful that you're still alive. But one of the funny things about open water swimming is when there's chop or swell, as you're swimming, you look back, you can't see the beach. And as you look ahead, you can't see the next marker because it's obscured by the waves. All of a sudden, you feel very small and helpless when you look around and realise it's just you alone in what feels like the open ocean. You know the horizon's there, you know the beach is back there, but you can't see it, and you feel helpless. Well, that's what the writer of Ecclesiastes is speaking about. The teacher is saying God has set eternity in our hearts, and yet we can't access it. We know it's there, but it's beyond our reach. Now in verses 12, 13, 14, he says, look, I know there's nothing better for people to do than to be happy and to do good while they live, that they may eat and drink and find satisfaction. That is the gift of God. So God says it's good to enjoy the moments of life. It's good to enjoy today. Enjoy today, and when you do, be thankful to God He's given it to you as a gift. But all the time in the back of our minds, as we enjoy today, we know that we have no control over tomorrow. And so the teacher says at the end of verse 14, I know that everything God does will endure forever. Nothing can be added to it, nothing taken away from it. God does it so that people will fear Him. Enjoy these days, but recognize that when you cannot see into tomorrow, don't despair, but turn to God and fear Him. God is the God who ordains all time, not you, not me. And so God has given us this sense of eternity which feels just beyond our grasp, not so that we'll go crazy, but so that we might reach out and fear Him. There is one part missing to this wonderful poem that begins the chapter, and we only discover what it is in verses 16 and 17. And I saw something else under the sun. In the place of judgment, wickedness was there, and in the place of justice, wickedness was there. Verse 17, I said to myself, God will bring into judgment both the righteous and the wicked, for there will be a time for every activity and a time to judge every deed. Did you notice in the poem at the start of the chapter, a time for judgment was noticeably lacking? You see, it's God's judgment that makes sense of all the time that we have under the sun. How do you know when it's the time to embrace or a time to cease embracing? How do you know when it's a time to keep and a time to throw away? Who decides what's right and wrong? Who decides when the right time is for things? And the answer is, right buried there at the end of verse 17, God decides. Because God is the one who will bring judgment. With judgment comes justice. You can't have justice without someone making a call and saying, this is wrong and this is right, and I'm going to keep the right and I'm going to punish the wrong. We should be glad that God brings judgment, because without judgment there is no justice. God says there will be a time for judgment. And remember that, because every decision we make here in the time we have today will eventually be judged in eternity. And that is how you choose what you are to do with your time. Well, you might feel like that's the end of the chapter, but it goes on into verses 18 and 22, and it feels like it takes a bit of a hard turn because the teacher starts talking about animals, and you think, what's that got to do with anything? But if you've had time to browse through 18 to 22, what the teacher is doing is he's saying, you know what? We are so special. God has put eternity in the human heart. He hasn't done that with animals. He hasn't done that with anything else He's created. He's made us in His image. He's made us special. And we have this privilege of being able to yearn for something more, to know that there is something beyond the horizon. And yet at the same time, verses 18 to 22 also reminds us that while we are special and different, there is a very important sense in which we are the same as the animals too. Do you know how we're exactly the same as the animals? Have a look at verse 19. Surely the fate of human beings is like that of the animals. The same fate awaits them both. As one dies, so the other dies. Despite the fact we have a yearning for eternity, you and I will one day soon die. Just like all the animals, just like the trees and the fish and the birds. You see, on the one hand, we are incredibly special. But on the other hand, we are just the same as the animals, weak, fragile. It is part of the frustration of the teacher's cry. Hevel, remember that? Hevel, meaningless, futile, empty, like the wind. That is our lives. We are eternal creatures, says the teacher, who are stuck in the mud. That's what verses 18 to 22 remind us. And yet, at the very end, verse 22, so I saw that there is nothing better for a person to do than to enjoy their work because that is their lot. For who can bring them to see what will happen after them? The chapter ends with a question. It's an unanswered question. The teacher himself has yet to come to a conclusion. Who can bring us to see what will happen after us? Is there any way that we can break through time, that we can see into tomorrow? Is there any way that we can get a sense of clarity on that yearning we have for an unknown eternity? Well, if you're a Christian, you know that this is not all the Bible has to say on the topic. And so I want to finish today by flipping forward to Ephesians chapter 1, verses 8 and 10. Ephesians chapter 1, verse 8 and 10. We pick up mid-sentence. Paul is talking about God's incredible plan and amazing blessings that are ours in his Son Jesus. And he says that he has made known to us the mystery of his will, according to his good pleasure, which he's put in purpose through Christ. And that is to bring all things together, all things in heaven and on earth, together under Christ. God has revealed the future to us. He has made known his big plan for tomorrow. We're not told what time we should get up or who we should marry or what job we should get. But we are told how the story finally ends. Our yearning for eternity is satisfied as we look forward and see that glimpse of God's eternal cosmic plan fulfilled in Christ. That in the end, all things will be gathered together under his good rule. You can get on board with that, or you can fight and rage against it. But in the end, that is what will be. And that is a huge encouragement for those of us who live life under the sun, desperate for a yearning of eternity. God has given us a glimpse. We know it's good. We know it's safe. We know it is certain. And we know if we are in Christ, it belongs to us. Well, look forward to seeing you for episode 4. It's easy to remember, chapter 4 for episode 4. So read ahead and we'll see you soon.